Hi, Steve. Thank you for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Lovely to meet you.
You too. It's an honour to speak to you. You've had a brilliant career in music and music production. We'll go back to the start, really. When did you know that's what you wanted to do in life?
I guess I've always wanted to be creating music, but as a sound engineer, producer rather than an artist. I never really wanted to be an artist. I always wanted to make the records. I was always intrigued by the sound of records, even from a very, very early age.
What was it about that like gripped you?
Well, when I was growing up, this was the sort of mid 60s when I first was really aware of it. And I was always fascinated when I would hear records on the radio. Why did a Beatles record sound so different to a Motown record? And why did a Motown record sound so different to a ska record? Because it wasn't called reggae then, it was like the early ska sort of sound, because I got a lot of those records from Jamaica and Motown because my parents loved that music, and my mum's friend in particular, Rita, was Jamaican, and she used to have access to all those early records. So I grew up listening to Harry J and the All Stars and Prince Buster and all those records before Bob Marley was even on the scene. So my reggae was pre Bob Marley, and also the very early Motown records. But also, my aunt was kind of in the West End, and so she had a lot of those sort of Broadway style musicals. So it just, when you compare all those things, they're so different sonically. And I thought that's really fascinating.
When you left school at 17, you went around different studios looking for a job. What was that like? And like, how did you deal with the rejection at the start?
Well, I didn't actually have huge amounts of rejection, but I had a couple of weird sliding doors moments. So one of the first ones, which was really weird, was I had made some appointments to see studios. I'd written letters and everything. And in those days, there was a sort of book called Kemp's, which was like a sort of yellow pages or a phone directory, but only for studios, recording studios, record companies, manufacturing. Because again, in those days, manufacturing was quite prevalent. So it was a list of all those people. So if you wanted to sort of record in a studio, go to a record company, or have a record physically made or a tape, you could. So I had all the addresses, and I went to a few of the studios, and two in particular. I went to Polydor Studios, which, and anyone knows the West End of London, where HMV Records used to be in Oxford Street. Polydor Studios was around the corner from there, so halfway down the famous Oxford Street. And I went to knock on the door and I said, and it was a very strange thing. As I went in, the receptionist said, "Oh, are you here for your appointment? Are you from the school in Kent?" And I went, "That's really weird." And I don't have a Kent accent. And I said, "Yes," because that was the truth. And she said, "Oh, come this way." And what apparently had happened was there was a music college in Kent, which I never went to, but apparently somebody had made an appointment and hadn't turned up. So I was shown all around the studio, which was fantastic. And then after that, I went and had a sort of quick whistle stop tour of CBS Studios. CBS Studios is on Whitfield Street, which is by Tottenham Court Road. So, a 10-minute walk between the two. And I had a look around the studio, and that was a really interesting situation because they said, "Oh, this is the studio." Da, da, da. And I caught my last train back because at that time I was obviously still at school. And I caught the last train back to Canterbury West Station. And Canterbury West Station on a Wednesday used to have a market, and my mum worked at the market selling costume jewelry. The lady next to her sold eggs. And this is so mad because we're having a conversation. So I got back. I guess I must have caught the sort of maybe 3 o'clock train or something because I was there as the market was closing around 4:35. And the lady that sold eggs said, "Oh, I didn't know you wanted to be a sound engineer." She said, "My son is a sound engineer." And I said, "Oh, that's really interesting." She said, "He works for CBS Studios." I went, "I've just been there." And she said, "Well, I'm going to call him tonight and speak to him." Her son, sadly no longer with us, but her son was the very famous Mike Ross Trevor, the sound engineer of many, many huge records in the 60s. And during the sort of Later part worked with John Williams on many of the scores. You know, he's a really, but when I was 17, he had just come off the back of that late 60s recordings. And so, he taught me the craft. And I met him many years, of course, over the years. He passed away just a couple of years ago.
It's crazy how little moments in life can lead up to things,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Mm.
So, what was your first thoughts of being in a studio then when you were getting took around?
Well, it's very different for kids today because I do run the Steve Levine masterclass for some of the students at Lipper. And most of the students that come to me today have got some recording experience because it's so easy to, even with a laptop like we're using now, you can create something pretty impressive. Whereas even a few years ago, that was impossible. And certainly in my day, unless you had a recording studio, recording at home was very, very rare because the equipment was so expensive and multi-track recording wasn't really available for home recording. It wasn't until the 80s when Tascam very famously bought out the Porter Studio, which was the first cassette multi-track, that home recording and what we kind of know today happened. So for me, it was more the fascination of wanting to record. And when I first went into Polydor Studios, that wasn't the very first recording studio I'd been in. I'd actually been into an advertising recording studio a bit before because my dad had a fruit stall in Wardour Street, and where they used to store the barrows overnight, next to there was a famous advertising studio. In fact, piece of bizarre trivia, where that studio is, and they used to do all the things like the martini adverts in the 70s, those really great. So that particular building, it still exists, but it's actually Steve Coogan's office.
Really?
How mad is that?
So, you did get the job at CBS.
Yeah.
What was the first sessions that you worked on?
Well, the very first sessions I worked on actually were with Mike Ross, and they were some classical sessions actually, because Mike Ross also worked quite a lot with John Williams, the guitarist. I know we mentioned the film composer, but also the guitarist John Williams. And so some of my very first sessions were classical based sessions and a lot of jingles. The time in those days, jingles were very, very popular to be recorded at studios with session musicians. And then it went on to to loads and loads of different sessions, because you're essentially the tape op. So the role of the tape op in those days was to help the engineer and the assistant engineer set the studio up before the session, with the cables and the mics and everything. Then prepare the tape machine, because before every session, the tape machine needs to be aligned for that day. And you need to know, how many players and whatever, and sort of be in charge of the tracks. Track management was quite important in those days because when I started, it was 16 track and then it moved to 24 track fairly quickly. But that's, kids today, 16 tracks sounded like a lot then, but it's not a lot. And you had to manage where things were. And the purpose of the tape op was also to, when a song was recorded, work out where all the sections in the song were. So if the producer on the session said, "Oh, Steve, can you go back to the second chorus?" you had to wind the tape exactly to that point and then press play, because the counters in those days were mechanical. They weren't electronic. So they would, slip a bit. So you'd have to make sure you knew where everything was. And of course, if a band did three takes, for example, of a particular song, you'd have to put the leader tape in of the master and so on and so forth. So it was a fascinating job. The most creative part of the job was if you were recording vocals or guitars as overdubs and you had to do the famous punch in. That was a really skilled job, to drop into record at the right moment and then drop out of record again. And again, in those days, there was no undo button. If you went into record and you wiped something, it was gone.
Did it take you a bit of time to adapt to it all then?
Not really, because I went to a technical school and I felt kind of match fit. I sort of knew all about it, and there's a difference between the theory and the practice, but I put the theory into practice very quickly.
One of the first bands you worked with, one of my favourite bands, is The Clash. What was that like?
Well, CBS had a really brilliant policy. So they had three studios in the complex. So Studio One was the huge studio which did mainly classical music and big rock productions. If you wanted that giant drum sound, you would go into Studio One. Studio Two was the kind of cool studio that had all the best equipment and was a medium-sized studio. Studio Three was the studio that had the kind of leftover equipment from the other studios and was a bit kind of funky, but it was very cost effective for CBS Records. And I mentioned that CBS Studios was located on Whitfield Street by Tottenham Court Road. CBS Records was in Soho Square, a 3 or 4 minute walk away. So what would happen is if an A&R executive would see a band in a pub, they would then offer the band a day or 2 days of free studio time, no strings attached. They could record the demos at CBS Studios number 3. It was of zero cost to the record company. The band had to, find their own way there and record. And then if the record company didn't sign them, the band would then be free to take those masters, those demo masters, to someone else. So it was a constant flow of bands coming through. And the story of the Clash was they were just initially another band that came through, along with many of the other punk bands. Because if you look at the timeline of that period, there were loads and loads of bands all playing around London. It was quite London centric at that time. And so the Clash came in and did their demos, of which White Riot was one of those demos. And the record company came down unusually the next day, but in the afternoon of the session, and loved what they heard and signed a deal with them. I think there's, it's been well reported, signed a deal very, very quickly. Maybe as quickly as a week or so later. The deal seemed to be signed very quickly, and then we were back in recording the album. There wasn't much of a gap between those demo sessions and the master sessions, which then became the album. And then we carried on working over the years. Simon Humphrey and I recorded many, many tracks. Simon was the main engineer. I was this tape op initially, then assistant. And then when we got to the last track we ever recorded with the Clash was White Man in Hammersmith Palais, which we actually split that because we recorded some of it in Studio 3, but those that know that song, there's actually a piano on that song, and we recorded that in Studio 2. And so we split that session up. So I was recording some downstairs with Mick, while upstairs Simon was recording some other bits with Joe. It was like a kind of two-way thing. So that's the journey of the Clash. So from the literally the first time they'd ever been in the studio all the way up to Hammersmith. That was the last one we did with them. And in between that, tons of other punk bands, the Vibrators, the Drones. We also did, I mentioned about CBS letting the bands have their tapes. We did the original demos for XTC, but CBS Records didn't sign them. But those very same tapes that we worked on were the thing that Andy Partridge managed to use to get the deal with Virgin Records.
With the Clash, you mentioned like an A&R man would go see them live and then give them the opportunity to go record. I know you sometimes go see bands live as well, wouldn't you? Can you tell how good they're going to be when they're live, or is it only when they're in the studio you can tell how good they're going to be?
It's a lot easier today. It was very difficult around the time of the Clash because most of those bands played in pubs, certainly when they were starting. It was 50 people, and very few pubs had anywhere near a decent PA. I mean, if a pub had any PA, it was normally because they were doing bingo night, or dare I say it, in those days, strippers in the pub. So it was like for the compere to go, come on now, here she comes. It was like really. So what you heard was the noise of the band, and it was really hard to tell. Having said that, now PAs in various venues, no matter how big, is really good. There's a place here in Liverpool that I went to see a band the other day. It's a very small venue. The sound was fantastic. So the answer to your question is it's easier today than it was. So you can get an idea. And also it's not always about how it sounds in the venue. It's how the band interact with the audience, because that can be something that really helps. If a band have a great rapport with the audience, that can make a big difference into the way that you perceive the event.
You mentioned before you started learning about the production side of things through classical music. Then obviously punk comes along, and punk's all about DIY and learning as you go along. So were you glad that punk came along and gave you that opportunity to learn as you went along as well?
Absolutely. And the thing about, the whole punk generation, we're all roughly the same age. We were all kind of 17 or 18 when we started, and we were trying things out. And the good thing about punk is, or any generation that comes again, it was the same with sampling, the same with dance music. each new generation kind of breaks the rules of the previous generation, and you learn different techniques or different concepts of how you would record. It's really valuable. It's always a learning curve. I learn every day.
I was going to ask you that. Obviously, when bands come to the studio, they learn off of you, but do you learn off of bands as well?
It's always a two-way street. It depends on the type of band, but certainly in terms of, for example, the Hush Tones, who I've been working with, and we've got a single out at the moment, and the album's coming out in September. That's a very guitar orientated sound. And so the sound of the electric guitar just through an amp can be, a fairly ordinary sound. The choice of pedals that you use before the amp can make a huge difference in the way the track sounds. And in one particular song, we were working on a sound in the chorus. Like we want the guitarist Mick from the band had a riff, and he was playing the riff. And in fact, in this particular case, he was playing in the control room here, where I'm speaking to you from now, and the amplifier was in the studio because a lot of bands like to prefer well, they prefer the sonic quality of being in the control room rather than being in the studio on headphones. And it doesn't make a huge difference. And if they're more happy playing, you can't do that with feedback. You do need to be next to the amp if you want that loud, raucous feedback. But other than that, you can play in the control room. And I've got all the appropriate interfaces and cables so the guitar is sounding as good as it possibly can be. And it just wasn't cutting it, the part. It wasn't really working. And then we just sort of went through a couple of different pedals, and I put together a combination that I wouldn't normally do of some delay and some reverb and a bit of distortion. And it just became this brilliant sound. And I really remember it. Mick was playing the guitar, and then Martha, the lead singer, came in. She said, "Oh, what's that sound? It sounds fantastic." And that became a signature sound to the record, and so when the album comes out, that's something that I'll be very proud for people to hear, because it's like, oh my God, that's a really interesting sound. So that's a two-way learning curve, in terms of sound, but also how important sound is to the way you perceive, in this case, the chorus of the record.
Would you say working with The Clash was when you started to make a name for yourself in the music business?
No, it wasn't. It was after that. What happened was Simon and I worked on, as I said, all these various records. What began to be very noticeable in the world was, people forget, if you look at the late 70s timeline, you've got the remains of the glam rock period, they're kind of at the end of their life. You've got punk coming through, but you also have disco and great American music. Look at when Fleetwood Mac's Rumours was released. You've got three prong, and actually also you've got a lot of kind of really pop stuff as well, really shiny pop. So you've got these four, I guess, four strands of, and also reggae was beginning, lovers rock and reggae was beginning to come towards the end of the 70s in a big way post Bob Marley kind of opened the door. But if you look at records that were released as we hit the 80s, all this lovers rock came through. So you've got different genres. What Simon and I decided to do was that disco was really big. And disco at the time was very much driven by producers as opposed to artists. So if you look at Giorgio Moroder and Pete Bellotti, Sharon, and a lot of those Italian producers, these were producer teams that made records and got guest artists in to sing the tracks or guest performance. So Simon and I decided that's what we were going to do because we wanted to be producers. So Simon and I made a record and put that out, and it started to make waves because it was, us using our skill. Then what happened was that we then essentially went out in the freelance world. We were fired from CBS, but that gave us an opportunity because everyone started to know that we were really good at what we did. And then that's when things started to move forward because bands were approaching us saying, "Oh, we'd love you to work, whatever." And in fact, it got so much so that Simon and I, both started working independently. I mean, we didn't fall out or anything. We just was working on so many different things. It was better for him to be doing this one and him to be, and if there's a slight difference in our musical taste, Simon was working with bands like Secret Affair, and I'd help a little bit on some of those sessions. And then I was working on some more soulful thing. There was all sorts of different things we were doing in that freelance world, and we did produce a couple of tracks together. It just was the way it was. And then I started moving more towards the retro punk period, hence working with the Angelic Upstarts, where if you think of how music developed, punk morphed into this sort of kind of electronic. A lot of the bands like Heaven 17, Joy Division, which became New Order, Orchestral Maneuvers. These are bands that had guitars and drums, but they also had drum machines and synthesizers. And Angelic Upstarts had already had a loud punk period, and they approached me because they wanted to have a bit more of the synthesizer and drum machine technology, which I was then getting a name for myself as being able to do that sort of thing.
The band you most associated with is Culture Club. You did a lot of work with them. What did you first think of the band?
Well, my first meeting with the band was in the studio because I'd met John Moss a few months earlier, um, and essentially no one was really. So the A&R executive that was involved in the Angelic Upstarts gave me a couple of days free studio time, like we used to do with the Clash. EMI Records had a similar policy. They would put bands in their Manchester Square studio, not Abbey Road, unfortunately, but the Manchester Square studio. So he essentially said, "Look, I'll give you a couple of days to do some demos with Culture Club and see how we get on." And so my first meeting of George, Roy, and Mikey was in the studio. As I said, I'd previously met John. And the first demo that we did was White Boy Dance and I'm Afraid of Me, those two tracks, which became the first two singles. EMI decided that they didn't want to sign the band, and those demos eventually got us the deal with Virgin Records. And as you know, those records came out and did okay, but they didn't do well. And it wasn't until the third single, "Do You Really Want to Hurt Me," that things changed, and then they changed dramatically.
What was it like when that Do You Really Want to Hurt Me came out? Did it change your life, really?
All of our lives, it absolutely, and although we'd been working on it for quite some time, and the timeline, and we were out on tour when it happened, it people say it changes your life overnight. It was the Top of the Pops appearance that changed it. Once they were on Top of the Pops, and I had a feeling once they were on Top of the Pops it would be different, and they did Top of the Pops, and the very next day everyone was talking about that band, and it went from just outside the top 30. I'm around 34, 36. Can't remember exactly. Up and up and up, and eventually became number one.
Can you remember when it went to number one?
I can, and I can remember exactly what happened. We were in Glasgow and Edinburgh doing some dates, and their kind of radio plugger guy, Ronnie Gurr, was with us because there was the concerts were getting bigger and bigger. They were very small venues that we started with because again, nobody cared about Culture Club in the beginning. So the venues were very tiny, but as the record was going up the charts, the venues started getting bigger and we'd have to double up the dates. So if they were booked in, these small venues in Scotland, they'd do two nights or two go, because the demand was so great. But I do remember we were in Glasgow and or was it Edinburgh? Hang on, let me just think. No, I think it was Edinburgh actually. Sorry, because we were jumping between the two cities. But we were in the hotel, and I remember George and Ronnie Gurr coming into my bedroom, going, "We're number one," and it is a phenomenal feeling.
Yeah, it must be crazy, especially back then when the
Mm.
charts meant so much. Like you say, Top of the Pops as well.
And also, the record sales back then were phenomenal. I mean, a band would be so happy to have a quarter of what we sold. A record then sold quite a lot of units. You'd be so lucky to sell that many today.
At that point, then, are you getting a lot of offers coming in then to work with bands?
Yeah, it happened fairly quickly after that, because it was quite a unique sound. So you're absolutely correct. It did.
So after the debut album, you worked on the next two Culture Club albums.
Yeah.
So you've had success with the debut album. Do you approach the recordings the same for the next two, or do you change it up a bit when you know you've had success?
No, it was, we all wanted that success. And the first album was done on a very, very slender budget. And so when we started the second album, we actually started the second album in two chunks. So the timeline was the first album came out and Do You Really Want to Hurt Me was successful, but we didn't have a follow-up single because the album was already out and had done okay, but Do You Really Want to Hurt Me propelled it. We then went in and recorded Time Clock of the Heart as a standalone single, but the album at that time wasn't even released in America, so the American versions of the album have time added to it. The UK ones don't. This was then just before Christmas. And so immediately after Christmas, we went back in the studio and we cut Church of the Poison Mind and one of the album tracks called Mr. Man. Then we had a small break because they had some dates that were booked before that they had to do. And I also was working on a couple of other projects as well. And then we rekindled and got back into the studio, then did the bulk of the rest of the album. And that includes obviously Karma Chameleon and all the It's American, all those tracks.
Did you have as much success with Karma Chameleon than you did Do You Really Want to Hurt Me?
Well, Karma Chameleon was a hit almost immediately. I think it's fair to say that Do You Really Want to Hurt Me was a slow grower. You know, it started very low down in the charts and then after the Top of the Pops exploded. The other records were also hits, big hits, but they had a timeline where they were pre-played on the radio, then they were released, and then they were pre-sale. So they went in the charts at a reasonably high level. Karma Chameleon exploded almost immediately. It was one of those strange things, and it's often been quoted as being one of those classic songs of an earworm. It has such a strong melody to it. Not only was it a big hit, it was number one for many, many weeks, and the sales were incredible. It sold over 1 million copies on the single alone, which is incredible.
I'm sure it's like the £1 million question, but what do you think it is about those two songs, especially, that makes them such hits?
Timing is always everything, I think. And I think in the case of Karma Chameleon, George's ascendancy was going through the roof. And I think that it fulfilled all of those things. And it is an incredible melody.
You know, like with Karma Chameleon, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? They're the two you think of when you think of Culture Club.
Yeah,
But like you said, they had other hits as well, didn't they? Like Victims, Church of the Poison Mind. There's a lot. There is more songs in the back catalogue.
absolutely. I mean, you know, there is a big canon of work. And when you see the band play live, which they're out on tour at the moment, it sounds great because it's hit after hit after hit.
I want to talk a bit about Believe in It All. Is that a song Boy George wrote for you?
Well, we wrote it together. So what had happened? I'm very impressed with your research because I love that song, and it was released whenever it was, 84, I think, and it was pipped in the charts by a couple of other things. But yeah, it's a great record. What happened was I was asked by Chrysalis Records to make a kind of an album. I mean, it's actually the model is not dissimilar from what I'm doing today with Baltic Jazz Recordings. Essentially, session players and artists that I've worked with collaborating and cross collaborating on the projects. And that Steve Levine project was supposed to be that sort of thing. And Believing It All was a track that we started, and George co-wrote it with me, and it was fantastic because George and I had actually written several songs before then, because after Culture Club's first recordings there was a very big gap before any success, and so we were all kind of working on a million different projects at once, and George was writing with me for other people. You know, there was a couple of projects I was producing where George had co-written. There's a couple where George did backing vocals. There was also a couple where Roy did some guitars. So we were trying to do all sorts of different things. So working with George was very common. You know, we had done this. It wasn't out of the blue. And Believing It All was one of those songs that we kind of started, but then once we got in the studio, we finished it off. I love it. I think it's a really good song. But sadly, at the point of release, Chrysalis Records split its company, and so we were victims of, bad timing. You said earlier about Karma Chameleon. That was good timing. Believing It All was bad timing.
It is like a proper 80s pop song, like a catchy song in it, Believe It All.
Absolutely, and it's got lots of cross collaborations on it. I mean, there's the backing vocals on there, Rita Marley, and it's a Mikey's playing bass on that record.
Did you enjoy songwriting yourself then?
Love it. And I'm loving it even more now because with Baltic Jazz, we're doing virtually every song is a co-write with the people I'm working with. I started as a songwriter. That is the strange thing with this. Simon and I mentioned the disco world earlier. Simon and I then were writing songs, and we had a couple of very close calls of nearly big hits as songwriters. So my first kind of, if you like, success and income was actually as a songwriter rather than a record producer. So yes, I love songwriting. I love it.
What are some of the songs that you've wrote that
Well, I
people...
have done exactly. This is the strange thing. My career path took a different road. So those that do the research will be able to find some of my songs. I'll tell you one of them, which is really funny because it's a good story. So Simon and I wrote a song and we sent it. We cut a demo of it, which was a really good demo. I loved the demo. And completely madly, the 3 Degrees covered the song.
Really?
Yep. So we thought, well, this is going to be a big hit.
Oh,
Big hit.
was
But it wasn't because
it?
no, it didn't even come out because their manager at the time was trying to renegotiate his deal with the record company and then kind of stopped it coming out. So the producer of that record, Simon and I were not the producers, it was we were just the songwriters. The producer was a famous producer called Bidu, and he really loved the track that he'd cut. So he then got Kelly Marie to sing on the same track. So it came out as a Kelly Marie record. So there you go. One of those one of those strange moments. And before that, I had another artist, and we'd written a song. So I've not had the kind of songwriting success that's matched my record production success, but I have more recently. So the most recent records I've all done, currently we have Mavy's new single "So Glad," which is out, which is currently on the Welsh A list and the Jazz FM A list, which is a co-write. So I've got some good records out at the moment that are co-writes.
And you did work with the Beach Boys. What was that like?
Fascinating because of course we're from different eras, but it was an incredible period in my life. And as you say, Bruce Johnson was very important in my career. And when the Beach Boys were at that point when they wanted to make a record, I stepped into the foray. And it's interesting because I'm the only other producer to have produced the Beach Boys other than Brian Wilson.
That's crazy. What was Brian Wilson like? 'Cause you had an all right experience with him, but he can be difficult.
Fabulous. Yeah. No, I had a great relationship with him and to this day have a good relationship. I think it's very hard being anybody like that. It's you cannot comprehend how difficult it is being Brian Wilson or being Paul McCartney. It's just so hard. And so consequently, those people tend to surround themselves with very tight circles of people that they know and trust because everybody with those people wants something off of you.
Yeah, yeah.
An autograph, a picture, or whatever. Everybody, that's all they want. Everyone wants something off you. They don't bring anything to the party. It's both sad and lonely on one aspect, and obviously, they're successful, but it's a very hard position to be in. People don't ever understand, and only a few people are in that position. You can count on a few hands. Same with Boy George. His private life and his personal life, it's always being invaded. It's one of those strange things how people are. It's like a Victorian freak show.
Was it with the Beach Boys where they had a massive entourage of people with them?
Yes.
Was that hard to deal with in the studio?
No, they were banned from the studio. But actually, Carl Wilson's famous quote is, "The Beach Boys have a bad case of entourage."
Do you get that? Have you had that with any other people where, like,
No. And anyone that's watched the Love and Mercy film, if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. It's phenomenally accurate.
Stevie Wonder was actually in the studio with them, wasn't he?
Yes.
What was that like?
Fabulous, because of course Stevie is one of my heroes. So get to work with him was incredible. Absolutely incredible.
What was he co-writing a song or something?
He co-wrote it. Well, it was co-written with him and Sarita Wright. The Beach Boys didn't write the song. He approached me with the song, and I said, "I'd love to do the song, but I want you to play on the record." And he said, "Of course." And so he came to the studio, played the instruments on the track, and they sang on it.
I know you mentioned like you had a really good relationship with Brian Wilson. Have you had any difficult people though, like where you've got to like adapt to that what they want and stuff?
Well, I think I've been fortunate, but also it takes a lot of effort. So most of my sessions, without exception, have been enjoyable, and I'm still friends with most of the people that I have worked with. There've been one or two sessions in my career that have not gone the way that I would have perhaps liked. I haven't fallen out with anybody during a session or anything like that. That's never happened. I've never had a sort of fighting match and then everyone's left the studio. You hear these stories of that's never happened to me. I've never had one of those situations. But we have had sessions that have been less than satisfactory. And in many, many cases, it's normally external pressures that cause the problem. And, or people behaving appallingly. I mean, it's the way it goes. It's not for this podcast, but there are some people in the business that are not pleasant, and they go on the list and you try and avoid them. But generally speaking, I work with nice people and I try and avoid working with unpleasant people.
It's like anything in the world, though, in any like working space, you're gonna get that.
You can tell very quickly. I mean, a good example of that is a band like Westworld that I worked with, who initially didn't want to work with me. And for some reason, I've no idea why. And we had a mutual friend, a publisher called Steve Lewis, and said, Steve, you should meet them, and he persuaded the band to meet me, having not wanting to work with me. I knew within the first 10 seconds of that meeting that this was going to happen, and we've been friends for life. In fact, Durwood has just released an album a few months ago, and he asked me to master it for him. So, from not wanting to work with me to a lovely relationship, because they didn't know me. I think that that's the problem, is we're talking about Sir Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson. There's the image that the public have of these people and the reality, and they can be very different. And then people presumably have views about me, having not met me or worked with me, and sometimes perhaps those are the wrong views.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. Yeah.
And I'm proud to say that the relationships I have with the artists I'm working with are good.
What has it been like teaching your craft to other producers coming through?
That's really fascinating. And I'm very, very pleased to report that the generations that are coming through at the moment are really focused on the craft of record production. And I'm also very pleased to say that the ratio of male and female is getting almost equal. A few years ago, it was probably 80-20 male female, but it's very, very equal now. And I'm very encouraged by that. There's a lot of really great young women that want to be music producers and are working tirelessly towards that. That can only be a good thing.
Well, you started your own record label. When did that come about?
That came about because post COVID, I was starting to work on a project actually with the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra. You mentioned about classical stuff, earlier. It goes right through. What happened was that they had a project that they wanted to be involved in, and it meant that you have to book the orchestra many, many, many months ahead. But what happened was they then got a load of bookings for live events and they get quite a lot more income from the live events. So they wanted to postpone my sessions for the summer while they did the live events, which meant I had a big block of free time in my studio. And my wife and I had this conversation. She said, well, you've been wanting to do this jazz stuff. Why don't you do it? So that was literally, it was a, let me do it. And we started it and we've had some fantastic success. This is like my new thing, Baltic Jazz Recordings. And along with the indie bands I'm working with, as I mentioned before, Hush Tones are a band I've been working with just before lockdown. And we have a new record out at the moment and an album coming out in September. And currently on Baltic Jazz, we've got Mavy's single out as we speak. And literally a few days ago, Jess Edie's EP came out. So that's fantastic. And yesterday and today, I'm working on the next bunch of releases, which will be kind of July-ish. So Baltic Jazz Recordings is my new label, but it's a sort of hybrid of everything I've learned.
Yeah, it sounds brilliant. You mentioned an artist before, Mavy.
Yeah.
She's just released the latest single, So Glad. What can you tell us about that single and Mavy in particular?
Well, Mavy is a lovely artist and I really enjoy working with her. And you said about songwriting earlier. So I thoroughly enjoy writing with her. We have a very, very good songwriting relationship. She came to me via somebody that I'd met back in the Culture Club days. So there's an older manager that I knew who was not to do with Culture Club, but he was in the sort of circle of Culture Club. And he was managing various artists. And he came across Mavy and he phoned me. This was just before lockdown, and he said, Steve, I've just found this great artist. I'd love to bring her to work with you. I think you'd really get on. And he was absolutely right. We did really get on, and we do really get on. And so he wasn't representing it. It was just as a friend, I'd like to introduce you to her. And we've been working ever since, and we love working together. And the new single came about because I previously worked with MT Jones on his brilliant record Forever and a Day, which I absolutely love. I think it's one of my best productions ever. I love it because, again, when Mavie first heard that, she said that's such a Steve Levine record because it kind of sounds like Time Clock of the Heart in, you know, a modern version because it's got all of the same soulful energy of Time Clock of the Heart. I love it to bits. I think it's a great record. And she said, I'd love to do something like that. And I said, okay. And then Mikey and I wrote a sort of an idea, and then we developed it into this what has become a great song. I love it. It's really good.
Well, I wanted to actually ask you, what album are you most proud of that you've worked on?
Well, that's a difficult question. From a commercial point of view, Color by Numbers without exception. No except, because it was so, so successful. But over the years, there's many things that I'm very proud of. I'm extremely, you haven't heard it yet because it's not out, but I'm very proud of the Hush Tones album. This was done over a period of time, and we're very proud of that record. There's some fantastic songs on it. But over the years of the different records I've worked on, I'm pleased with everything I've done. And then there's certain highlights on certain tracks. I enjoyed working with the Honeys in the 90s. And I think that, Finally Found is a really great record. It's a great song and it was a big hit. I love that. I love the work I did with David Grant. I love what you mentioned, the Beach Boys. That's really good. And then on one or two albums here, there, and everywhere, I've got, certain tracks that I think are particularly good. You think, oh, that was really good. I worked with an American band called The Beauties, which wasn't very successful, but there's some stuff on that record that was fantastic. I really love it. So it's the same as a director with a film or an actor. You start with the best intentions, and sometimes circumstances get the better of you, or the world changes. So you can release something and you can have a sliding doors moment, and
Who have you watched, like a musician in the studio, that you've been most in like awe of the talent?
Well, Stevie Wonder, absolutely. But more recently, if you listen to Mavie's record Futuristic, which features Mama Terra, Marco from Mama Terra is a stunning player. And I have to say, I'm very impressed with his jazz playing. He's really fantastic, really fantastic.
So, Steve, you've got an event coming up in Liverpool. What can you tell us about that?
This year is my 50th anniversary. I started in July 1975. So Katie Puckrick and I are having an in conversation at the Liverpool Philharmonic Music Room on Sunday, the 8th of June from 7:30. And it's an in conversation discussing my career, similar to what we've just done, in even more detail with some special bits of treats, like some special audio. So hopefully you come along. I think it's nearly sold out. There might be a couple of tickets left, but try and come along. It's great.
That sounds brilliant, Steve. And thank you for joining me on the podcast. It's been a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to speak to you.